Today we move to the topic of earning and spending. I thought this was a finance class, but let me remind all of us that God has set up this particular cycle of earning and spending. In order to build a solid foundation for our thinking, building the house, as it were, of our financial thinking, we need to think about how do we get into this responsibility of having finances to be a good manager of. And it starts with this cycle that God set up as the sovereign God, His world, His earth, His people. And He says, here's how it's going to work. It didn't have to be set up this way. God could have just made the deposit every week in our account. If He owns it all, and He's so generous, He might have said, you don't have to work. I'll just provide it all. That's kind of what happened to Israel when they were in the wilderness with the manna. I know they had to work and go out and get it, but they didn't bake the little cakes, coriander, whatever it was. They didn't bake those. God just handed it to them. Then when the birds flew over, they were hungry for meat. They just reached up and grabbed it till they were sick of it. God could have set up a system where we are just provided for everything. We just sit there and take it in. But in His wisdom, He set up a system of earning. And therefore, we have resources, finances, gold and silver, paychecks, checking accounts, etc. And then spending, which is the distribution of that which we have earned. Now, there are good reasons to have this earning-spending cycle, and it's rooted as deeply as back in Genesis 1, where we start out that in the beginning, God worked at setting up our world. It's a longer discussion, but there's a lot of rootage about who we are, made in the image of God, how we need to work in order to fulfill the very way that we were created. Now, when we do work and then spend, first principle I want to lay down this morning is that God looks very seriously upon how we handle our wealth. This is not a light matter. Somebody has said that how we handle our money is both a test and can be a testimony. God very seriously looks upon how we handle our wealth. Here's the scriptural support for it out of Luke 16. It says, so if you have not been trustworthy in handling worldly wealth, who will trust you with true riches? Now, it'd be nice to stop and have a discussion. What are the true riches? Certainly not the things that are going to pass, the material things we may accumulate, or even our paycheck, that disappears, our money. But God says, I'm watching how you do with this stuff. Now, if you can be trusted, if you become a good manager and a good steward, then I, in fact, will give to you true riches. Now, we could make some suggestions of what that might be. It might be eternal things, like if we can become generous and invest in kingdom things, then there are true riches which are going to carry into heaven with people that have found Christ, with people that we have become a part of discipling and building into their lives. But it may be even more personal and closer than that, where in fact when we become obedient to Christ, there is a certain level of inner peace and satisfaction. Or another way we might put it, maybe the true riches is finding intimacy with Christ. Because there's not this division, we're doing good at going to church and reading our Bible and having our prayer, but finances, I'm sorry, God. And there's this little separation with our intimacy with Him. So this is a profound verse where it says God is watching, and He will only give us the real true riches if, in fact, we're handling our material things well. Now, there's this survey up on the screen. There's a man by the name of Brian Cluth. He was a evangelical free church pastor in Colorado Springs. God began using him about 15 years ago in the area of generosity. In fact, the name of his organization is Maximum Generosity. He finally got so consuming that he's left the pastorate. Now he works out of his office in Denver. But this is a result of every year he does two big surveys. It was just the U.S., now it's moved beyond. But the one is called the State of the Plate. The second one is called the State of the Church. Now, I'm going to summarize this because I know it's kind of small, but here is the story in this survey. 5,444 Christians were surveyed. So this is not secular versus Christian. And in the green column, the percentages of those 5,444 people surveyed, he's labeled that as Christian tithers. That does not necessarily mean people that gave 10% or even call themselves tithers, but they at least gave 10%. So it's people that give more than that. On the right-hand column are Christians who failed to meet that 10% tithe level. And then next week, we'll be talking more, as I was asked last week, are we going to talk about giving and tithing? Next week we will do that and unpack it more. But for Brian Klu's survey, it was just simply, here are people, we could use the word in the green, are generous. Here are people on the right who are holding it very tightly and say, I can't afford to be generous toward God or other people. And you can at least see maybe the categories. And you'll notice the green and the left column, people are always in better shape than the red in the right column. And that doesn't make sense. If you're giving more away, how can you be better off financially? But in fact, it's God's mathematics. Somewhere in my library, I have a little book called God's Mathematics. It's reversed. The Mosaic mark, we're talking about the upside-down kingdom going through the book of Mark. Math is upside down for God. The more we give, according to this chart, 5,444 people, the better off we're going to be. Debt-free, 28% of generous people. 13%. Mortgage, 52.66. And you go down that list, and you'll find both on debt and on net worth. When we get down to the last one, or on the third one, they have estates and assets of more than $250,000. 58% for people who are generous. 46%. Now, it's symbolized by the arrows on the left-hand side that if you're in the green column, generous, giving away, holding it loosely, it's an up kind of trajectory going through life. If you're holding it tightly, if you're kind of stingy and just kind of give grudgingly to God rather than joyfully, it is much less pleasant to work through life that way. Now, secondly, Jesus knew the potential risk of dealing with our material wealth. Jesus was not naive in this whole challenge of us and our money and our material possessions. And here's how he put it in Matthew 6, part of the Sermon on the Mount. No one can serve two masters. So he's saying you got God and money, the last two words of this verse. He says you can't serve both sides. Either you will hate the one and love the other, you'll be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money. That's a pretty forward statement. When we, in our earning spending cycle, we're left with money, how do we manage it? How do we do it in a way that pleases God? And he says you can't do both. Well, God, I kind of sit on the fence. I love you, but I love my stuff. Now, God says it doesn't work. It just does not work. You're going to be leaning one way or the other. There's a video that we will watch in part in our last session. And the guy's name is Alan Barnhart. And there'll be a part that we don't watch. But he starts out his testimony about generosity saying, I studied all the passages in Scripture that talk about God and money. And he says, here's what I was left with, a fear of the Lord. And he goes, not scared of the Lord, but wow, this is serious. And he has a great testimony of being super generous, 99% giver. Okay? And God has blessed him beyond numbers, too many zeros to count. But God says you can't be on the fence on this thing of money and me. Either we're going to be following our possessions or we're going to be following God passionately. And I didn't say the statement, but he said you can't do both. There is a phrase about the things that we possess here and death, and how people fear death. And one analysis of that is asking the question, why are you so afraid of dying? Well, it may be because we feel we're going toward our treasure or away from our treasure. Get that? If our treasures are just on earth, Matthew 6:19, I don't want to leave them. Man, I've spent a lifetime accumulating it, and I got just the house I want, just the car I want, just the IRA, and just the retirement plan, and God, you're going to take me out of that? Well, God says, we lean one way or the other. But if our treasures are in heaven, wow, can't wait to get there. Made my eternal deposits. It's better than it'll ever be here. No crying, tears, pain, sorrow, all of the things that we deal with on a daily basis. Now, it may be the reason because God looks so seriously upon our wealth. And it's a test of whether he can trust us with true riches. That Jesus, while he was here on earth and throughout the Bible, there are 2,350 verses that have to do with finances and our material possessions. On my Christmas list, on the Gister thing we use for our family, I put, this year I want a stewardship Bible. Somebody has gone through all of the scriptures and have underlined every passage and made little commentaries. And so that's part of my goal this year, to go through the whole Bible and just look at these 2,000, sometimes they say 2,500 verses, but over 2,000 verses that talk about this issue of our stewardship of the material things that God has given for us. Jesus himself talked more about material wealth than prayer, heaven, faith, hope, etc. Now that to me, again, is a sobering statistic. And part of why I'm passionate, and part of why 10 years ago, when I went to the Generosity Conference, that my heart began to change. Because if Jesus talked that much about it, then for whatever you allow me to do in these later years of life, God, I want to be talking about it too. So it's a great privilege to talk and teach about what Jesus talked about most. It's not the only thing, but it certainly was important to Jesus and to the whole Bible. God looks for faithfulness in managing his possessions. That's bottom line. It's not a casual thing, it's not incidental, and it's not unimportant with regard to what we do financially, stewardship, management of what God has given to us. In the Matthew 25 parable that Christ told, he said, "Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful with a few things. I'll put you in charge of many things. Come and share your master's happiness." A couple observations. One, we might change that word faithful servant to faithful steward. Well done, good and faithful steward. I was watching how you did with your finances. I was watching you in your stewardship. Well done. And then, you've been faithful with a few things. God looks for faithfulness. But I'll put you in charge of many things. This is one of the passages where we go to give substantiation, support for the phrase, what we do with our stuff will determine how we spend eternity. Okay? Because Christ said, if you've been faithful down here, I'm going to give you things to do in eternity. We'll touch on that with work here as we get to it in a few minutes. Another one, which is the negative side, what if you're not faithful? What if you're not doing well with finances? A sobering verse. Jesus told his disciples, Luke 16, there was a rich man. Okay, he had a lot. The manager was accused of wasting his possessions. He turned it over to a manager, a steward, like we are a manager or steward before God. But he was accused of wasting his possessions. He was a poor steward. And in the story, what happened? So he called him in, the boss called him in, and asked him, what's this I hear about you? Give an account in your management. You cannot be manager any longer. God has the option, if I understand the point of this story that Christ was telling, God has the option, if we are not being good stewards and managers, to withdraw some of what he's entrusted to us. That is a sobering verse. Okay? If we want God's full blessing, then part of it is to have our financial house in order and move not only to material things, but true riches as we looked previously in the verse. Now, watch this little video. I think it'll be fun.